We got about 2 more minutes before we kick it off with Dave Rendall from all the way from Paris, France, not Paris, Tennessee. Is that right, Dave?
That is correct.
Yeah. You'll have to come to Tennessee and visit, and we'll and we could drive up to Paris, which is the catfish capital of the world. And we could run
nice.
The 40-foot catfish that sits in the middle of the town square.
Very
it's
nice.
Kind of like the Eiffel Tower, not exactly.
Similar. I'll be in Chattanooga in September for the Ironman, so I'll be up there in Tennessee.
One of our coaches, Marshall Martin, is competing in that as well. He's been training. Nice. He's got I guess it's about 100 days away, so he's kicking in his. He called it 100 days of hell this morning.
Yeah. Well, yeah, probably 100 days until it starts like tapering or something.
Right. That course, you looked at the course, I assume?
I mean, I looked at elevation charts and stuff. I haven't been to the actual course yet. It's pretty hilly.
It is. There is a very big mountain there.
But I did, my first one was Ironman Lake Placid, so that was in the mountains as well. So I'm
perfect.
I've been there. It's not great, but I've done it.
All right, so hopefully everybody can hear us okay.
Did we ever get a response to whether people can hear us or not?
Not in the chat.
Okay.
Unmute it there real quick, Kate. Let's see. Oh, here we go. All right, looks like everybody's good. Dave, you all set? Dave.
I'm here.
There you go.
Hello?
Yep. Yeah. I think we muted you as well.
Yeah.
All right, let's get started. You ready, Dave?
I see how it is. Yeah.
All right, I'll give you just a quick intro to Dave. I've known Dave for, Dave, maybe 4 years or so?
That's about right.
About right. The first time we met, we were at MIT doing the Entrepreneurs Masters program together. You spoke, and then I spoke after that. And as I recall, it was the first time that you wore pink. Is that pretty accurate?
That's the first time I wore my pink pants.
Pink pants. So I wanted to. So I'm one of the first people to ever get to see you in pink pants, which I go around telling a lot of people about this day. So I've gotten to see Dave speak at Gazelle Summit. We did the event at Advantage Media where we're both authors together there. Multiple times per year, Dave speaks all around the world. He's in France right now. He just did a tour. I'm sure he'll tell you a little bit about that. He's been in Europe speaking. And early on, we had lots of conversations about what he does and how he does it and how he can improve it. It's just been a really good ride and a really good friend of mine, also a really good friend of Petra's. So we wanted to bring Dave on today to speak to you about his book, The Freak Factor, Discovering Uniqueness by Flaunting Weakness. And I think he's got a ton of great insights. He's going to make you think a little bit differently than you think when you hopped on this morning. So I'll turn it over to Dave and we'll get this thing going.
All right, cool. So yeah, like Andy said, I'm here in Paris, took a break from seeing the sights. It's about 6:30 here. And I'm really excited to be on here. It'll be a little different because since you can't see me, it changes some of my stories. But I think that's actually part of the story. Part of the story is I'm here in Paris because I was speaking at 3 of Vern's Growth Summits, Scale Up Summits in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Barcelona. Then I spoke again in London on Saturday, and now my wife and I are here in Paris, and that's going to end up being a big part of the story that I want to share with you today. So the first thing, like like Andy said, is that we want to think differently. I want you to think differently today. I want to challenge the way we've been taught to think about things. And the main thing specifically that I want us to think differently about is the way we think about weaknesses. I want us to have an awakening to see that everything we've learned about weakness is wrong. You're on this call because you want to get better. You're on this call because you want to improve your business, because you want to be more successful. But I think a lot of times, most of us have been taught the wrong thing about how exactly it is that we get better, how we become more successful. And the main lie that I think we've been told is that we need to find our weaknesses and fix them. Our parents, our teachers, our employers teach us that we need to find our weaknesses and improve them if we want to be more successful. And I'm going to argue that the direct opposite of that is true, and that there's a different way to be better. There's a different way to have a better business. There's a different way to have a better career. There's a different way to have better relationships, and it's the opposite of sort of what we've been taught. So this story starts when I was younger. I was always in trouble at school, and I couldn't sit still and be quiet and do what I was told. Teachers didn't like me very much. They called me obnoxious. They called me rebellious. They called me inappropriate. They called me immature. They told me I had no self-discipline and no self-control, and if I didn't fix those things, I was going to end up homeless and living in a van down by the river. Usually the teachers would give up on me and they'd send me to the principal's office. I remember I was in 3rd grade, so I was 8 years old. I got sent to the principal's office. He sat me down in his lap, which seems questionable now looking back on it. And he told me that there's 3 kinds of bad people in this world. He told me that there's bad people, there's really bad people, and there's people who are too far gone. I have to remember I'm 8 years old, and this guy has the right intentions. He's trying to help me. He's trying to help me succeed. He's teaching me what his parents and his employers and his teachers have taught him, which is that I need to learn to sit still, be quiet, and do what I'm told. I need to learn to control myself. I need to learn these simple and fundamental skills, because if I can't, I'm never going to be able to do the more difficult and complex things that life requires. And I'm not the only one who had trouble at school. Ken Robinson said many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And let's start with the beginning there. They think they're not. It doesn't say thought they weren't. It doesn't say many highly talented, brilliant, creative people thought they weren't. It doesn't say that they've had the realization and now they know. It says they still think they're not. At 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, 70 years old. There are people out there, highly talented, brilliant, creative people who think they're not still, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. They had something. They had a uniqueness. They had a strength. They had an advantage. But at school, it wasn't valued. It was ignored or denied, or it was actually stigmatized. We told them the best thing about them was actually the worst thing about them. We told them that their biggest strength was actually a weakness. And in many cases, again, they still believe that. And I realized that's what happened to me. And that's why I started by telling you where I was. I wasn't bragging. I was telling you where I was. I was in Paris, and why I was here, because I was on a speaking trip, because that's the key part of this story. I got in trouble my whole life because I couldn't sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. My parents called me Motor Mouth. It was a nickname designed to shame me into being quiet. At dinner, they'd call me Motor Mouth. While we were waiting to be seated at restaurants, they'd call me Motor Mouth. When we were in the car, they'd call me Motor Mouth. It was a constant battle for them to try to get me to be quiet, to get me to calm down, and it didn't work. And it's lucky for me that it didn't work, because I get paid to do 3 things now. I get paid to travel around the world, standing up, not sitting down, talking, not being quiet, and running my own business, not doing what other people tell me to do. I didn't become a successful person because I learned the lessons that my parents taught me, and I learned how to sit still and be quiet and do what I was told. It wasn't because I learned the lesson the principal taught me and I learned to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. It wasn't because the teachers finally got through to me and I learned to sit still, be quiet, and do what I was told. It's because I realized at some point in my adult life, sort of by accident, and that's part of the reason for this presentation, sort of by accident, that my biggest weaknesses were also strengths, and that I shouldn't be fixing them, that I should be flaunting them. Flaunt means to parade without shame. That I should be amplifying them, that I should be turning up the volume on them instead of turning them down. I've been able to speak on every inhabited continent. Like I said, just in the last 5 days, I've spoken in 4 different countries. I've been able to see amazing parts of the world. Last year I did 95 presentations, the most presentations that I've ever done, worked with some companies like Microsoft. All because I finally realized that the things I was trying to fix were the things I should be flaunting. The things that I was trying to repair were the things that I should have been amplifying. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I have a really simple idea. It's that what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. The very things that make us unusual, that make us stick out, that make us unique are the most wonderful and most powerful things about us, and that the things that seem to make us weak, they do make us weak. I still can't sit still and be quiet and do what I'm told, but they also make us strong. There's a flip side, there's another side. And when I realized that was true for me, I started to wonder whether it was true for other people as well. And that's where this presentation came from. That's where my book, The Freak Factor, came from. That's where the book, The Freak Factor for Kids, came from. That's where my assessment came from. It helps people discover their strengths and weaknesses. I learned that what makes us weird also makes us wonderful. What makes us weak also makes us strong. This isn't just my story. This is the story of people all over the world. And it's definitely the story of people in business. And so the first step in this process, there's sort of a framework that we're going to go through today. And the first step is awareness. We have to understand that weaknesses are clues to our strengths. If every weakness has a corresponding strength, then we can find our strengths and other people's strengths by looking at their weaknesses and looking for the corresponding strength. And one of the reasons this is important is because of something psychologists call negativity bias. Negativity bias says we tend to see what's wrong instead of what's right in any given situation, even if what's wrong is really, really small and what's right is really, really big. So a simple example of this is having a stain on your shirt. Imagine someone had a stain on their shirt at work, or I had a stain on my shirt and I was there in person giving a presentation. Everyone in the room would be looking at that stain and thinking negative things about me as a human being. No one would be looking at the stain, no matter how positive and encouraging you think you are. There's no one who would be looking at that stain and thinking to themselves, you know what? That Dave Rendall's doing a good job, because 98% of that shirt is stain free. Nice job, Dave. Nice job. And yet that's not a subjective perspective. That's not spin control. That's an objective, measurable, scientific reality. A small stain on your shirt means that most of the shirt, 98, 99% of the shirt is stain free, and that's actually important. If you were asked to rate my appearance at the end of a presentation and I had a stain on my shirt, most people would give me a failing grade, and a lot of people would even give me a 0 because we shouldn't have stains on our clothes. But if you're a child, if a student in high school, if a student in college gets 98% on every single thing that they do in school, they're going to graduate at the top of their class. They're going to graduate with a 4.0. They're going to get scholarships. They're going to get job offers. They're going to be very, very successful. When we look at our own strengths and weaknesses, when we look at the strengths and weaknesses of our children, we look at the strengths and weaknesses of our employees, we tend to see what's wrong instead of what's right. We tend to see the weaknesses and miss the strengths. And that's okay, because as Parker Palmer says, we're led to truth by our weaknesses as well as our strengths. We're led to truth by our weaknesses as well as our strengths. If every weakness has a corresponding strength, then we can find strength. We can use negativity bias to our advantage. And as we see what's wrong with other people, we can find what's right with them. We can't fix negativity bias, and there's nothing wrong with negativity bias. It's a fundamental way that our brains work, but we need to ask a different question. Normally, when we're confronted with another person's weaknesses, we don't look for the corresponding strength. We start to wonder, I wonder what else is wrong with them. And now what we can do is say, wait a second, for every weakness, there's a corresponding strength. Now that I know this person's weakness, I wonder what the corresponding strength is. And all of you can do this. This is a simple exercise, and we'll practice here, even though it's sort of difficult to do a lot of things with feedback over a webinar. But I'll tell you a story about my daughter, and I'm sure you'll see the strength that's hiding inside of her weakness. So my youngest daughter, her name is Sophia, and one of her weaknesses is dishonesty. She's a liar. She's tells lies and doesn't tell the truth, even when it doesn't even help her. She does it even when it isn't beneficial. It doesn't get her anything. And so I'm going to tell you a story about one of her lies, one of the favorite lies I've ever heard her tell. And I want you to think about what the strength is that connects with her weakness. I want us to practice finding a strength hiding inside of a weakness. So when Sophia was sent to kindergarten, when she went to kindergarten, the first day of kindergarten, the teacher said to bring a snack. So my daughter packed a small bottle of water and some Townhouse crackers, some Ritz crackers, put them in a Ziploc bag, and she took them with her to school. When snack time rolled around, the teacher asked each of the kids individually if they had a snack, and my daughter said yes, she did have a snack, and she got out her snack. And some of the other kids, though, didn't have a snack. They didn't get out their snack, and my daughter watched what happened. And what happened was they didn't get in trouble. They didn't get reprimanded. They didn't get criticized. The teacher didn't take down their names so she could send a note home to their parents. She didn't want those kids to be left out. That's what she asked about the snack. And when a kid didn't have a snack, she got them some cookies and some juice. Now, my daughter was not pleased about this at all. She's sitting there with crackers and water. She basically has prison rations. These other kids are being rewarded for terrible behavior, for failing to do what was asked of them with cookies and juice. So my daughter's not happy with this, and so she raised her hand. And when the teacher called on her, she said, "Sophia, what can I do for you? What's the matter?" Sophia said, "I forgot. I'm actually allergic to water." Right? Sophia lied about having an allergy to one of the most basic substances in the human body because she wasn't happy about missing out on cookies and juice. She wanted cookies and juice, and she wanted to find a way to get cookies and juice. And when I tell that story, and I ask audiences to tell me what her strengths are, they shout out some things like persistence and negotiation and being unwilling to just accept whatever's given to her. And then they almost always shout out creativity or creative thinking or imagination. That's exactly right. Imagination especially is one of Sophia's biggest strengths. She loves to play with dolls and stuffed animals. She loves to play pretend. She loves to tell stories. She loves to act out little dramas with her and her stuffed animals and her toys and her Legos. She lives in an imaginary world, and sometimes she tries to sell her imaginary world to the rest of us as reality, and we call that dishonesty. But my daughter isn't just a sociopath. She's not fundamentally immoral. She has a weakness that's also a strength, and I'm sure that some of you were able to see that, and maybe even other strengths as well, because I asked you to. And it really isn't that hard, and as you do this, as you start to have this new awareness, we can start to see the best things about people hiding inside the worst things about them. What makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. And if that's true, we can use negativity bias to our advantage, and we can find our strengths and the strengths of other people hiding inside of their weaknesses. The next step is acceptance. We've all taken personality tests. I know Petra uses a lot of DISC assessments. People take MBTIs. But nobody ever gets an assessment back that says, you're amazing, don't change, right? It comes back and there's 42 pages telling you how to get better, telling you to adjust, and telling you to adapt. And I'm not going to argue with anything the Petra people tell you about that. I think the awareness part of that is really, really important. But I don't teach people to adapt and to adjust. I teach people to accept. If weaknesses are strengths in disguise, what I want you to do is accept the results as being a fundamental part of who you are, and not worry about changing them, worry about working with them instead of against them. And we're going to talk about how to do that. But first, I want to get more into this idea of acceptance. So I want to introduce you to two people. The first one is Adventurous Al. Adventurous Al loves to go on trips. While he's on those trips, he loves to climb up things and jump out of things. He doesn't have a steady job. He only works long enough to make enough money for his next trip. He doesn't own a home. He doesn't rent a home. He doesn't own a car. He doesn't rent a car. He's always on the move. And on one of his trips, he meets a beautiful woman, and her name is Librarian Lucy. Now, Librarian Lucy is steady, and she's reliable, and she's dependable, and she has a job, and she has a career plan, and she has a master's degree, and she has money in savings, and she has money in her 401k plan, and she owns a home, and she's paid off her car already. And when Al and Lucy meet, they fall in love. It's a love story. And the reason they fall in love, when I ask audiences this, the reason they fall in love is because, well, everybody tells us that opposites attract. But we need to go a little bit farther and ask us why do opposites attract? And what a lot of people say is, well, because the one person has something the other person doesn't have. And that's true to some extent, but it's only the beginning, because if someone has Ebola and I don't have Ebola, it doesn't cause me to wish I had their Ebola. So opposites attract, and they attract because someone has something I don't have. But they attract because the other person has something I don't have, but I believe I should have. Lucy's been told her whole life that she needs to loosen up and have some fun, and Al's been told his whole life that he needs to grow up and settle down. And they meet and they fall in love because they see in the other person everything they're not, but that they believe they should be. George Eliot said, we all begin to believe what the world believes about us. And Al's been told his whole life that he needs to grow up and settle down. And Lucy's been told her whole life that she needs to loosen up and have some fun. And so they see in the other person everything they're not, but they believe they should be. So they fall in love. It's a love story. And then they get married. And so here's what I want you to think about. They get married and they're married for 5 years, and we check in with them 5 years later. How do you think that marriage is going? The answer to that is really simple. They're divorced and there's restraining orders in place. Right? But the question is, why are they divorced and why are restraining orders in place? And here's the answer: because the very thing that attracted them, the very characteristics that attracted them have started to repel them. The very things that they hoped would rub off on them about the other person have started to rub them the wrong way. Now, what do I mean by that? When they met each other, they framed each other's neutral characteristics in a positive way. Psychologists call this framing. I don't think we really have strengths and weaknesses. I think what we have and what we need to accept are neutral characteristics. We are whatever we are. And so what psychologists say that we do when we look at another person and we look at ourselves and we look at those characteristics is we frame them in a certain way. We frame them positively or we frame them negatively. And so when Al and Lucy met, they framed each other's neutral characteristics in a positive way, and that's why they found the other person so attractive. They didn't even just think the other person was attractive, they wanted to be more like that other person. Lucy wanted to be more adventurous and Al wanted to be more stable. They hoped to become a little more like the other person. That's how positively they saw the other person. But over time they started to reframe to look at those same characteristics differently, and the very characteristics that initially attracted them started to repel them. The very characteristics they hoped would rub off on them started to rub them the wrong way. And let's look at how that process works. So Lucy married Al because he was easygoing, adventurous, and spontaneous. But after a while, easygoing started to feel irresponsible, adventurous started to feel dangerous, and spontaneous started to feel impulsive. Now, it's easy to think, well, Dave, you know, those aren't exactly the same thing. It's easy to see how those are strengths on the left and how those are weaknesses on the right. But what I'm going to argue and what I want to show you is these are actually the same thing. Spontaneous and impulsive mean the same thing. They both mean to do things without planning or forethought, right? It's only in the way that we choose to look at it that spontaneous becomes a positive thing and impulsive becomes a negative thing. But regardless of whether someone's being spontaneous or impulsive, they're not thinking through, they're not thinking ahead about what it is that they're doing. Imagine a guy's driving home from work and someone's selling flowers on the side of the road, just a little pop-up shop or a little kiosk, or a person raising money for a nonprofit or something by selling flowers, and he decides, you know what, I love the lady in my life, I'm on my way home, there's flowers right here, I'm going to buy some and give them to her. It's not her birthday, it's not her anniversary, I haven't done anything wrong that I'm aware of, I just want to get her some flowers because the opportunity came up. So he brings the flowers home, and that's probably going to be perceived very positively by his lady. That's going to be seen as a spontaneous move, as a positive characteristic, and she's going to post on Facebook maybe about the flowers and talk about how spontaneous her man is. But if the next day that same man brings home a motorcycle, he's going to get a much different response probably. If the next day after that the man brings home a girlfriend, she's going to get all judgy about it and tell him that he's impulsive. He's in all of those situations, he wasn't thinking ahead about the consequences of his actions, but in one of them he was seen as spontaneous, and in two of them he was seen as impulsive, but in all of them he wasn't thinking ahead. And the same thing's true with Lucy. Al married her because she's structured, responsible, and cautious. Those are the strengths, those are the positive framing of those characteristics. But after a while, structured starts to feel inflexible, and responsible starts to feel controlling, and cautious starts to feel fearful. Every one of the strengths seems like a weakness after a while, and the problem is, the reason we don't accept this is because we think there's a way to separate the two. We think there's a way to be structured without being inflexible, to be responsible without being controlling, to be cautious without being fearful. And what I'm trying to argue is that that's not actually possible, that these are two sides of the same coin. Anytime a person has one of these qualities, they also have the other quality at the same time. Every weakness is the corresponding strength. Every characteristic is a strength and a weakness at the same time. A good way to think about this is side effects. There's no such thing as a medicine without side effects, and there's only way to reduce the side effects of a medicine or to also reduce the dosage or the benefit of that medicine. We can't fix weaknesses without damaging the corresponding strength. Once we recognize that weaknesses and strengths are connected, we need to accept that, and that has to change our behavior, because if we don't accept it, we end up damaging strengths as we try to fix weaknesses. And there's an easy way to illustrate this that I'm going to use here in a second. Peter Drucker said, strong people always have strong weaknesses too. Where there are peaks, there are valleys. I love that quote, right? Peter Drucker is one of the greatest management minds ever. He's one of the first people to really think through in detail the idea of managing other people. And he said, strong people always have strong weaknesses too. He didn't say sometimes, he didn't say occasionally. He said strong people always have strong weaknesses too. Where there are peaks, there are valleys. What this means is if you want to be a strong person, you're going to have strong weaknesses too. If you want a strong spouse or partner, they're going to have strong weaknesses too. If you want strong children, they're going to have strong weaknesses too. If you want strong employees, they're going to have strong weaknesses too. If you want a strong boss, they're going to have strong weaknesses too. Where there are peaks, there are valleys. But we don't accept this oftentimes, and we want to fix it. And what I argue is that when we try to fix the valleys, the only way to get the material to fix those valleys, to fill in those valleys, is to tear down the peaks, to damage the strengths. And a good way to illustrate this is with discount retail. Walmart is famous for one really big strength, and that is their low prices. Walmart has a lot of weaknesses, but we'll summarize them simply as poor service, poor quality, and poor design. Target, on the other hand, is strong in each of those areas. Their strengths are good service, good quality, good design. If you ask a group of people what they call Target, most people will shout out Target, right? Target, better service, better quality, better design. But no woman ever walks up to another woman and shows off her outfit and says, guess what, I got it at Walmart, right? Target is Target because of better service, better quality, better design. And people don't see Walmart that way. But why doesn't everybody shop at Target then? They have a big strength, better service, better quality, better design, three big strengths. And why doesn't everybody shop there if it's so much better? And it's because their prices are a little bit higher. So they have a weakness, and the weakness is low prices. So let's go back, or the weakness is that the prices aren't low enough. So let's go back to Walmart and let's fix them, right? Let's just fix service. Let's hire more people. Let's treat them better. Let's train them better. Let's give them better benefits. If Walmart did that, what would happen to their costs? And then what would happen to their prices? Their costs would go up, their prices would go up, and their strength would come down. Because the strength and weakness are connected, when you fix the weakness, you end up damaging the strength. And the same thing's true of Target. If they tried to fix their weakness and they tried to lower their prices, they would have to sacrifice service and sacrifice quality and sacrifice design, and they'd stop being Target and they'd start being Target again. And if you don't believe me, if you think we should be well-balanced and well-rounded, we should have just the right amount of each, we should try to fix those weaknesses and also build on our strengths at the same time. Let's look at a case study that shows us what happens when we do that, and it's called Kmart. Kmart used to be the low price leader. They had the blue light special. They were the savings place. They had the distribution, the reputation, the location. They had absolutely everything. And when Walmart came to town, all they had to do was lower their prices a little bit for a little while, and they could have put Walmart out of business. But instead, they hired Martha Stewart. They tried to be a little bit of Target and a little bit of Walmart, and they ended up bankrupt. They tried to be well-balanced and well-rounded, and they ended up bankrupt. And then after they went bankrupt and they came out of bankruptcy, they bought Sears, and now Sears and Kmart are going bankrupt again and closing stores all over the country. Nobody hates Kmart. Nobody thinks daily about the weaknesses of Kmart. Kmart doesn't have any big weaknesses, but they also don't have any big strengths. Kmart is invisible. Kmart is mediocre. Kmart is average. People drive past Kmart and drive past Walmart to go to a Target because they want to have a better experience. And people also drive past Kmart and drive past Target to go to Walmart because they want to save money and they don't value their psychological and emotional well-being. In both cases, the person's making a trade-off, but there's no trade-off to be made at Kmart. No one wants to go to Kmart, which is why they've gone bankrupt twice. They tried to be the middle choice. They tried to be well-balanced and try to be well-rounded. They tried to make sure they didn't have any real weaknesses, and maybe they don't. They're just so mediocre and so average they become invisible and no one wants to shop there. And regardless of whether you're a Target shopper, a Walmart shopper, or you don't shop at either place, what you have to acknowledge is they're both very successful companies while having big strengths and big weaknesses at the same time. In Uncommon Service by Francis Fry and Ann Morris, they say striving for all-around excellence leads directly to mediocrity. This isn't about fixing all of our weaknesses and building all of our strengths and being well-balanced and well-rounded. When we try to do that, we end up mediocre. This is about strong people have strong weaknesses too. This is about strong businesses have strong weaknesses too, and I'm going to give you some examples of that, and I just did. It's about accepting the fact that we have strengths and weaknesses, that they're connected, and that we can't separate them, that what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. And the next step is appreciation. We see that we succeed because of our weaknesses, not in spite of them. George Eliot said every limit is a beginning as well as an ending, and I want to show you the beginnings that come with the limits that we have. So a good example of this is dyslexia. Kids with dyslexia struggle to read and struggle to write, which also means that they struggle in school, and we've all been taught that if you struggle in school, you'll struggle in life, which is why they were really surprised when they were studying millionaires in the United Kingdom and discovered that 50%, over half of the millionaires in their study, had dyslexia, even though only 10% of people in the general population have dyslexia. They were studying entrepreneurs, people who started their own businesses in the United States, and discovered that 35% of the entrepreneurs in their study had dyslexia, even though only 10% of people in the general population have dyslexia. Ingvar Kamprad is the billionaire founder of IKEA. He has dyslexia. Richard Branson is the billionaire founder of the Virgin series of companies. He has dyslexia. But what we've all been told is, yeah, Richard Branson succeeded because he overcame his dyslexia. People succeed when they overcome their weaknesses, when they overcome their disabilities. But I think that's actually not the story, and Richard Branson agrees. Richard Branson said this. They asked him, how has dyslexia affected your success? And he said, strangely, I think my dyslexia has helped. What scientists are starting to realize is that people with dyslexia don't have broken brains, they have different brains. And the same brain that causes them to struggle in school causes them to succeed in life at a higher level than most other people ever will. Another good example of this is Paul Orfalea. He got kicked out of 4 high schools because he had ADD and dyslexia. Then he went to work for family-owned businesses and got kicked out of his own family's businesses. He got fired by his mom and dad and brothers and sisters, so he started his own business. He called it Kinko's, and he recently sold it to FedEx for $2.4 billion. And he said this, he said, I think everyone should have dyslexia. And that's a great example of appreciation. What he's saying is if you offered him a pill that would cure his dyslexia, he wouldn't take it. He wouldn't accept it. He doesn't want it. He sees that the peaks of his ability are connected to the valleys of his disability, that the advantages are connected to the disadvantages, and that if you took away the disadvantage, you took away the disability, you'd take away his abilities. When you took away the worst things about him, you take away the best things about him. He doesn't want that pill. He doesn't want to be cured. He loves his life the way it is. He thinks, he sees that what makes him weird makes him wonderful, and what makes him weak also makes him strong. And the same thing's true for the rest of us. And so if we thought differently, remember that was our first part, that's the first piece of this today, to think differently. We need to have an awakening, then we need awareness, we need acceptance, and then we need appreciation. If we thought differently, then we would act differently, we'd behave differently. We'd live our lives differently, we'd manage people differently, we'd parent differently, we'd treat each other differently in our relationships. And the first thing we do is amplification. We'd exaggerate weaknesses instead of eliminating them. We'd turn up the volume instead of turning it down. And I used this example earlier, but it's important. My job is a public speaker, a professional speaker. And unlike a lot of people, I'm not anything besides that. I'm not also a consultant. I'm not also a trainer. I'm not also somebody who has a coaching business. I'm not also anything else. The only thing that I get paid for is speaking. The only way that I can benefit from one speech is to get hired to do another speech. There's nothing behind it. There's nothing to the side of it. There's nothing else I'm trying to sell. There's nothing else I want anyone to buy. My superpower is speaking. The only thing I do is speaking. And the reason that's important is because I got in trouble my whole life because I couldn't sit still, be quiet, and do what I'm told. And what we've been taught is, well, you gotta, when you hear that you do too much of something, you gotta moderate it, you gotta control it, you gotta dial it back, you gotta adjust it. But that's not how I found success. I found success by going pro, by going full time at the thing that people told me I should stop doing. I quite literally turned up the volume when everyone told me to turn it down. The worst advice that we'll usually get in our life comes in that form. People tell you, oh, I love that you're so intense, but if you could just dial it back. I love it that you're so organized, but if you could just dial it back. I love it that you're so analytical, but if you could just dial it back. It's okay to be you. We just want a little bit less of you. And it's when you hear that you should be turning it up instead of turning it down. And let me give you an example. Jimmy Kimmel's a late night talk show host. He's a comedian. He has his own television show. And recently he was asked to host the White House Correspondents' Dinner. He's hosted the Emmys, I believe, 2 years in a row. And at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, he walked up to the podium at one point and seemed to be getting very serious and said, I just want to thank Mr. Mills, my 10th grade history teacher, who told me that I would never amount to anything if I didn't stop screwing around. Mr. Mills, I'm about to high-five the President of the United States of America. And then he high-fived the President of the United States of America, putting this woman in the most awkward picture of all time. And then he came back to the podium and he leaned in and he said, eat it, Mills. Now, I'm not here to be down on Mr. Mills, just like I'm not down on my parents, and just like I'm not down on the principal who told me to sit still and be quiet and do what I was told. They're all teaching us what their teachers and their parents and their employers taught them, which is that we need to learn to sit still and be quiet and do what we're told. That if we're screwing around, we need to stop screwing around. That if we're being childish and silly, we need to stop being childish and silly. But let's look at how Jimmy Kimmel ended up succeeding. He ended up succeeding by going pro in the very thing that Mr. Mills told him to stop doing. He got more childish, he got more silly, he got more ridiculous, he got more immature, and that's what made him successful. He amplified his weaknesses instead of eliminating them. How could you amplify your weaknesses? If you're a parent, how could you give your child who's hyperactive an opportunity to be even more hyperactive, to do even more things, to be physically active on a more regular basis, more often, for more of the time? If you're analytical, and people tell you you're too analytical or you need to dial it back, what's a way to be more analytical? If you're too intense, what's a way to be more intense? Last year I did a Ironman triathlon. I swam 2.4 miles, and then I biked 112 miles, and then I ran 26.2 miles. And when I finished that, I got a tremendous amount of positive feedback from people for being very, very, very active. But when I was a kid, I was very, very, very active. And all I heard was that I was hyperactive and that I needed some pills to calm me down. And we give millions of boys especially who have ADHD, we give them pills every day that supposedly fixes them and calms them down. But I didn't get praised and rewarded for finishing an Ironman because I found just the right amount of activity, because I was well balanced and well rounded with my level of activity. I got it for being very, very, very active. I got praised and rewarded for the very characteristic that I used to be criticized and punished for, not because I turned the volume down, but because I turned it up. And that's what we're talking about with amplification. Can you give yourself permission to amplify? Can you give your kids permission to amplify? Can you give your partner permission to amplify? Can you give your employees permission to amplify? What makes us weird also makes us wonderful. And if we believe that, we'd get weirder. What makes us weak also makes us strong. If we believed that, we'd be willing to get even weaker so that we could get stronger in other areas. Now, the next step is alignment, and this is important because some of you are panicking a little bit. And you're like, Dave, I just can't have all my employees turning up the volume. I can't have my kids turning up the volume. I can't have my spouse or partner turning up the volume on their weaknesses. I would never get away with turning up the volume on my weaknesses. So let's look at what I'm talking about there. We need to stop trying to fit in, and we need to start trying to find the right fit. There's a company in Denmark called Specialisterne, and they hire people with autism on purpose because two of the symptoms of autism are hyper-focus and doing the same thing over and over again. And two of the skills that they need in software testers at Specialist Stern are hyper-focus and doing the same thing over and over again. They've been so successful at Specialist Stern working with people with autism that now SAP, the global software giant, is looking for hundreds of people with autism from all over the world to do software testing with them. What they recognize is that there's no such thing really as strengths and weaknesses. There's certain situations that put the spotlight on what's best about us and take the spotlight off of what's wrong with us. There's certain situations that are a good match for who we are. What we need to do is we need to match who we are with where we are. Instead of trying to fix the person, we need to change the place. What Specialist Stern does is it takes people who are seen as having a disability, and it shows that they actually have a competitive advantage when they're in the right spot. Situations are powerful, and when things aren't working, the first temptation is to say, I need to change, when oftentimes what we need to do is change the situation for ourselves or for others. Another great example of this is Michael Phelps. He's the most decorated Olympian of all time, more gold medals than any swimmer and any Olympic athlete ever. But what a lot of people don't know is that he also had ADHD, and his mom had a decision to make. Do I give him a pill that quote unquote fixes him, or do I get involved in a situation where he can do the very thing that people are trying to keep him from doing? And she got him involved in athletics because he was hyperactive, right? No coach has ever sent a kid home from practice and said he's too hyperactive. He just keeps running and running and running and doing exercises and calisthenics and conditioning workouts, and he just won't slow down. No coach ever complains about a kid who's hyperactive. And Michael Phelps found the perfect match. Michael Phelps' mom found the perfect match for who he was, combined who he was with where he was, and now we celebrate him as disciplined and dedicated and determined, when in fact what it is a case of very, very good alignment. So how can you find the right fit? The right fit allows you to amplify those characteristics that other people are trying to get you to moderate. If you're saying, oh, Dave, I can't amplify the characteristics I have right now where I am, then you don't need to stop amplifying. What you need to do is find a situation that aligns with who you are, which allows you, and doesn't just allow you, it rewards you for amplifying. And we also need to do that for other people. Where does my kid fit? Where does my partner fit? Where do my employees fit? How can I give them more and more of that work and those activities that fit them, and less of that work that they have to fight and struggle to do? The next step is avoidance. To be the best at some things, we have to be the worst at other things. This is Matthias Schlitt. He's a German arm wrestler. As you look at the slide, you'll see that his right forearm is gigantic. It's 18 inches around. It's 3 times as big as his left forearm, and the rest of his body really doesn't have very much muscle on it at all. In fact, if you look at his left forearm, it's very, very, very skinny. He's a very skinny person with a giant right forearm, and he's an arm wrestler. He's found alignment, going back to our last step, he's found alignment between who he is and what he does, because see, he was born with something called KTS, and KTS is a disease in which, it's a condition in which a person has one of their limbs or part of one of their limbs grow to a gigantic size, especially as compared to the rest of their body. So his legs are both normal size and his arm is normal size, but his right forearm is gigantic. And there's nothing he can do about that. It's a weakness. They can't fix it. It's a disorder that they can't cure. And so what he did is he asked himself, what's the situation? Remember alignment. What's the situation that rewards me for having a giant right forearm? And the answer is arm wrestling. The only muscles you can use in arm wrestling are in your right forearm. And so he's got the perfect body. He's got the perfect body for arm wrestling. But what some people say is, hey, well, why doesn't he exercise his left forearm more? Why doesn't he exercise his left bicep more? Why doesn't he exercise the rest of his body more and make it match his gigantic right side? What's it going to hurt for him to be more well-balanced and well-rounded? Even if he can't fix the size of his right arm, he can build up the rest of his body to match and be more proportionate. And there's actually an answer to that question, and it's the same answer when people tell us, what's it going to hurt us to be more well-balanced and well-rounded? The answer to that is that you arm wrestle by weight class. You stand your entire body on the scale and you arm wrestle against people whose entire body weighs the same amount as yours does. What it would hurt Matthias Schlitt to build up muscle in the rest of his body is that he'd end up having to arm wrestle bigger and bigger people with bigger and bigger forearms. His huge advantage right now is not only is his right arm gigantic, but the rest of his body is really, really small, which means he's lighter in comparison to the people that he wrestles against, and yet his forearm is even bigger than theirs is because they're built proportionally. He's got a huge advantage because he found the right fit, alignment. But he's got an even bigger advantage because he understands avoidance, that you succeed not just because of what you do, but also because of what you choose deliberately not to do, because it doesn't matter, it's not important, or it counts against you. Little kids understand this. When they see me, I'm 6'6", and they ask me how tall I am, and the next question people always ask after asking me how tall I am is, did you play basketball? And I did, and kids understand that. If you have an advantage, you should take advantage of it, right? It makes perfect sense. If you have a strength, you should build on it. But what if I told them, no, don't stereotype me. I didn't play basketball. I always wanted to be a jockey and ride a horse to victory in the Kentucky Derby. That's a stupid goal. Right? That's a stupid goal because it throws away my strength and turns it into a weakness. Right? It takes the advantage that I have and it turns it into a disadvantage. There's nothing I can do as a person who's 6'6" to successfully beat a person who's the proper size for being a jockey. And when we try to fix our weaknesses, that's what we're doing. We're throwing away our strengths. We're damaging our strengths. We're harming ourselves. We're harming our chances for success as we try to do something we weren't designed for. And even little kids intuitively know that that's not the way to succeed. But the other thing that we think is, oh, Dave, I've got so much room for improvement in my area of weakness. So let's talk about that. You really don't have a lot of room for improvement in your area of weakness. When you're weak at something, you're probably very unlikely to become very much stronger at it. They did a study with kids who could read fairly well, or actually quite poorly. They could read 100 words a minute. They put the kids who struggled the most in a speed reading course, and they went from 100 words a minute to 150 words a minute, 50% improvement. But then they took kids, the good readers who could read 300 words a minute, and they put them in the same speed reading course, and they got them up to 3,000 words a minute. Right? So you got to ask yourself a question. Do you want to get 50% better, or do you want to get 1,000% better? Right? Working on your weaknesses, maybe you can make some improvement, maybe you can make some progress, but it's not going to be very much. You're not going to get much better fixing your weaknesses, but you can get a lot better building on your strengths. So that's one part of it. You don't get much better fixing weaknesses, but you can get a lot better building on your strengths. But there's another part of it. See, there's not much of a reward for fixing a weakness. We live in a world that teaches us that if we can get a little better at something, if we can improve our ability at something, we can get more of a reward for it. If you're a 0 out of 10 on something, become a 1 out of 10, and you'll get rewarded for that. Become a 2 out of 10 and you get rewarded more. Become a 3 out of 10 and you get rewarded more. If you can improve a weakness, if you can move up the scale, no matter how low you are, you can get rewarded. But that's actually the wrong scale. This is the way the scale really works. This is the way the graph really looks. When you're a 0 out of 10 on something and you become a 1, you get 0 reward. You become a 2, you get nothing for it. You become a 3, and there's no value in that. Even if you become a 5, there's really no benefit to you. Even though you've gone from a 0 to a 5, you've made massive improvement, but you're still mediocre. You're still average. You still haven't done anything to distinguish yourself. Where we all want to live on this chart, regardless of how much you can improve, we already talked about how you can improve more in your area of strength than you can in your area of weakness. But even if you could improve your weaknesses, it wouldn't really get you anything, because you'd go from being weak at something to being mediocre at something to being slightly above average at something, and there's very little reward for that. The rewards happen when you go from being good at something, being above average at something, being very good at something, and becoming even better at it. That's where the rewards become exponential. A great example of this is Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball minimum wage is $500,000, but in 2015, the highest paid player, Clayton Kershaw, in baseball got $30 million. He made 60 times what the lowest paid player in baseball did. His curve started going straight up. He's not 60 times better than another Major League Baseball player who's one of the best players in the whole world. You have to be one of the 400, 500 best players in the whole world to play in Major League Baseball. Clayton Kershaw is not 60 times as good, but he's making 60 times as much, because by just taking his ability up a tiny bit, and we already talked about how much you can improve your ability if you build on strengths, by moving his ability up just even a little bit, the rewards begin to become exponential. He makes 60 times what everybody else makes. That happened to me on a much smaller scale. Last year, I got to speak for Microsoft on September 29th of 2016. And it was my third time speaking for them and they kept inviting me back. And on the third time, they paid me the same amount that I'd made as my yearly salary in 1996. So in 2016, I got paid for 1 hour of my time, but I'd gotten paid for 2,000 hours of my time 20 years earlier in 1996 doing a full-time job. Not because I'd fixed my weaknesses, but because I built on my strengths to the point where my abilities had increased and I'd gone from being good at something to be very good at becoming very good at something to becoming one of the best at what I do. And the rewards, when you start moving towards the end, become exponential and start to increase very, very rapidly. So the question here is, what should you stop doing? What should you allow other people to stop doing? What are those activities that you should avoid? We need alignment. We need to find the right fit. But in order to spend more time, energy, and resources on what does fit us and allow other people to do the same, we need to stop doing those things that don't fit. And now some of you are thinking, and it's a good question, well, how's it going to get done? And that's the last point, which is affiliation. We're going to think differently, awareness, acceptance, appreciation. Then we're going to act differently. We're going to amplify. We're going to turn up the volume. We're going to find alignment. We're going to find the right fit. We're going to avoid. We're going to practice avoidance. We're going to stop doing some things so we can spend more time and energy doing other things. And then the last step is affiliation, to partner with people who are strong or we're weak. Let's remember Paul Orfalea. He got kicked out of 4 schools because of his ADHD and dyslexia, and then he built a company worth $2.4 billion. How do you run a company worth $2.4 billion when you can't read or write? And the answer is you hire people who can. And the reason I use that example is because reading and writing seem really fundamental, even more fundamental maybe than sitting still, being quiet, and doing what you're told. We would think that someone who was illiterate would be unable to be successful, and yet here's a person who's worth $2.4 billion, even though he cannot read and cannot write. So how did he do it? He collaborated with other people. We call it collaboration when you partner with people who are strong where you're weak in business, but it's called cheating when you do it in school. And so we need to partner with people who are strong where we're weak. And the reason I use Paul Orfalea's example is because if he could admit to being weak at reading and writing, if he can have such a fundamental inability, then you can certainly admit to having the weakness that you have, and you can find people to partner with who can accommodate and who can complement that weakness. But the problem is we tend to not see that other people are strong where we're weak. We tend to see that they are weak where we are strong. We don't tend to see that people have or are missing. We tend to see that they're missing what we have. And the other reason we don't partner with people who are strong where we're weak is because people we need the most are the people we like the least. When I have bottles of water and cups of water around the house, my wife, who's very structured and also inflexible, kind of like Librarian Lucy, is always taking my water and dumping it out and putting it in the recycles or putting it in the sink. My waters are always disappearing before I'm actually done with them, and it's very frustrating. That's the weakness, that's the frustration that I see, but there's another side to that. There's an upside. My life is very structured. My life is very organized. If my kids need batteries, I can call my wife up wherever she is, even if she's in another country, and find exactly where that type of battery is. And there's always the right amount, and they're always in just the right spot, and they're always easy to find, and she can always direct me to them because she's very organized. I can have a well-organized life without being more organized. I can have a more well-balanced and well-rounded life without being more well-balanced and well-rounded if I partner with someone who has what I don't have, but only if I have awareness of her strengths and weaknesses. I accept those strengths and weaknesses and stop trying to change them. And I actually appreciate the strengths and weaknesses, specifically the upside, and I stop worrying about the downside. Peter Drucker said organizations exist to make our strengths effective and our weaknesses irrelevant. Is that what your organization's doing? Right? Relationships should exist to make people's strengths effective and their weaknesses irrelevant. Parents and families exist to make people's strengths effective and their weaknesses irrelevant. But too often we're doing the opposite. We get so hung up on weaknesses, we get so concerned about fixing weaknesses that we make people worse instead of better. And we don't design situations in which people can have alignment, do more of what they're good at, avoidance, do less of what they're bad at, and real affiliation, real teamwork, partnering with people who have what we don't have. So who's strong where you're weak? I've been traveling all over the world. I've been seeing amazing architecture, and one example of amazing architecture is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower was built in 1173. It's been there for 844 years, and it's been leaning the whole time. They built it on a bad foundation. It's been leaning since the very beginning. But in the 1930s, Mussolini, who was the tourism director of Italy at the time, decided that the tower made Italians look bad, that it was a stain on the reputation of Italy, and he ordered his government engineers to straighten it up. We live in a world that loves to straighten things up and straighten things out. And fortunately for the city of Pisa, though, the government engineers failed when they tried to straighten it up. And I say that that's fortunate because millions of people have traveled millions of miles and spent millions of dollars to see a tower that leans. The city of Pisa has thrived because, not in spite of, the tower that leans. The people who run the tower now say it this way: because of its inclination, the tower has become the object of very special attention. It's going to be because of your inclination that your life and your work, your career becomes the object of very special attention. It's because of your business's inclination that becomes the object of very special attention. It's because of your kids' inclinations that they become the object of very special attention. We succeed because of our weaknesses, not in spite of them. The people who run the tower now say it's important to keep the current tilt due to the vital role that this element played in promoting the tourism industry of Pisa. That's what we need to be doing with ourselves and other people. We need to be keeping the current tilt instead of trying to straighten things up and straightening them out. My mission in life can be summed up with this quote by E. Cummings. He said, "We do not believe in ourselves until someone reveals that deep inside of us something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch." I didn't believe in myself until I was in college and someone came along and asked me to be a resident assistant when I thought I was the reason they had resident assistants. I didn't believe in myself until one person came along and showed me that deep inside of me something was valuable, the very thing that I thought was the most worthless thing about me, that it was worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch. I believe that it's crucial that we see that deep inside of ourselves something is valuable. And I hope that I've showed you today that the thing that maybe you've been told is the most worthless thing about you, a characteristic that you've been constantly trying to fix, that comes up on your performance evaluations, that comes up in your relationships, that always ends up on your New Year's resolutions, is actually a strength in addition to being a weakness, and something that you can take advantage of instead of something that you have to try to repair. But what I really hope is that I've showed you that deep inside of you something that's valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch, and that what will happen after this is that you'll become a person who sees in other people that deep inside of them something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch. And you start to reveal to other people in your organization, other people in your family, other people in your life that deep inside of them something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch, because what makes us weird also makes us wonderful, and what makes us weak also makes us strong. Thank you very much.
Awesome, David. Thank you for your time, buddy. You got a couple minutes for some questions?
I do, no problem. Yep.
Awesome. And there was some new content there. I hadn't seen all this presentation, especially towards the back end. I appreciate the new content. That's awesome.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Yeah.
So we'll take a minute. We still have several people on the line. It looks like about 80 have signed in, and a little over 100 are sitting in rooms. So I wanted to open the floor to any kind of questions that might come in. So if you've got a question, just type it in the question box. I'll read it to Dave and see if we can get some answers for you. I know throughout the presentation there was a lot of things that were bouncing around in your head to ask questions about, so now's a good time to do that. Where are you headed next, Dave?
I'm headed back home. I've got a presentation on Thursday back in the Raleigh area, and then I've got some presentations later in the month in Atlanta.
And I saw on your website today that there's a schedule on there of where you're going to be. So if anybody wants to attend live, I know this format's not ideal for a presentation like yours. Dave is very animated, and he wears crazy pink outfits. So if you can see him in your local city, please do that.
Even though I was all by myself, I was waving my arms around and stuff like that.
I'm sure. A couple of questions coming in. Will this be available to watch since the calendar invite did not account for the time zone? We'll fix that moving forward, and yes, it will be available. It'll take us a couple of days to repurpose it and get it up on the website. Let's
Yeah, and
see.
also if people go to my website, a good thing to share where they can see a little bit different view and see, as I've got my TEDx presentation on the website, and then also the full version of my keynote from the Fortune Growth Summit from a couple of years ago is on there, and that's a good way to share, or if people missed it, to see see a live version of the same thing.
Awesome. A few questions. Last part of the webinar about collaborating and finding those that complement you. I felt like a contradiction between Lucy and Adventure Man. Can you clarify?
So yeah, Lucy and Al probably got divorced, right? It's not a contradiction. It's that happens in most relationships. But if they had learned the lessons of awareness, acceptance, and appreciation, they could have partnered. They could have complemented each other. They could have lived happily ever after if they could have understood that they were reframing strength as weakness, and they were trying to fix something that was inseparable in the other person. So in my new book, in my Freak Factor book that I rewrote that came out about 1.5 years ago, I actually put a chapter in there on marriage. I put a chapter in there on parenting. I put a chapter in there on managing people. I kind of changed it from a career book and gave some specific applications for this. And I actually put a chapter in there on marriage, and we talked through how Al and Lucy could have stayed together, right? And the idea was that they accept it, they appreciate the other person's weaknesses and see that they're also strengths. And my idea was they could have built an adventure travel business together. And Lucy would have run the business and been behind the scenes and managed the office and managed the details, while Al went out and ran the trips, because Lucy didn't want to do the trips, and Lucy wasn't excited about that kind of adventure, but she loved to manage details, and she loved to get things working, and she loved to take care of things. And she was reliable and disciplined in doing that. And Al needed some adventure. Al needed to get out. Al needed to do more than just stay around the office all day. And so they could have partnered. They could have allowed each other to be the best at what each of them was the best at. They could have kept their relationship going if they would have affiliated, and they can only affiliate if they had awareness, acceptance, and appreciation. So the questioner is exactly right. It doesn't have to turn out the way that it did. The only reason that it did turn out that way, and the reason it normally does turn out that way, is because we don't have that awareness, we don't accept, we don't appreciate, and in fact, we do the exact opposite. We try to get the other person to change. Not only do we not appreciate them, we are very upset with them, and we start to dislike them. Sometimes we start to actually hate them. And so they're exactly right. Affiliation only works if we can do those other things first. And the reason I use that example, and it resonates with people, is because too often that's not what happens, right? It's the most common thing for us to just be frustrated by people's differences, to be seeing people's weaknesses instead of seeing their strengths. And so it doesn't have to turn out that way, but usually it does. And so I'm trying to encourage people to do things differently with affiliation than what sort of naturally happens without some kind of intervention. So that's a great point.
That's awesome. And you just described my my marriage and my working life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've had plenty of people tell me that either I saved their marriage, or if they would have heard this sooner, it would have saved their marriage. And so people really, and that's why I added the chapter on marriage. This really resonates with people's marriage experience, and people who haven't had that experience, who live with an opposite and live very happily and see the other person as complimenting them. That's just because they're doing what I'm talking about, which is living out these principles in accepting and appreciating the uniqueness of the other person instead of seeing it as a negative because the person isn't just like them.
Yeah, something that I've done for a long time is I got a little app called Daily Diary, and every day I think of something to appreciate my wife for. So it's just a little gratitude. Yeah. I type it in there, and I don't give it to her. She doesn't even know I do it. Well, she might now that I just announce it to the world. But I do it for me, so I can refocus on, because we are polar opposites in the home, and she doesn't work in the business as well. So I do have to make myself do that. You're going to love this next question. I think you've got a really good answer in your worksheets, which are probably on your website. What's a good strategy to find your greatest weakness in order to identify your greatest strength?
Yeah. So yeah, Andy, I'll get you guys a PDF copy. You know, we did that assessment like when we were down in Charleston. We've worked on those before. I'll get you that worksheet. You can send it out to everybody, the PDF version of it. So I've got a simple assessment. It's in the book as well, but it's great to do with teams. It's great to do with your partner, your spouse. That has you pick your top 5 weaknesses from a list of 52. Pick your top 5 strengths from a list of 52. Sometimes I think the list helps because you look at them and you can kind of multiple choice. You don't have to just kind of close your eyes and think, you know, what's wrong with me. I don't think that's usually the hardest part, to find what's wrong with you, because if you've got kids, they'll tell you. If you've got a partner or a spouse, they'll tell you. If you've got a boss, they'll tell you. If you've got a business partner, they'll tell you. Oftentimes we tell ourselves. So once we know that every weakness has a corresponding strength, we fill out the weaknesses, we fill out the strengths, and then the last page, the third page of the chart, shows how every weakness has a corresponding strength. So let's say someone gets criticized for being stubborn, that's the weakness. The strength is being persistent. Somebody gets criticized for being critical and judgmental. The strength is usually that they're analytical and rational. They get criticized for being a perfectionist. The strength is that they're detail oriented. They get criticized for being inflexible. The strength is that they're organized. They get criticized for being blunt and rude. The strength is that they're direct and honest. So the simple way is it facilitates that reframing of negativity bias of, you could really skip the first 2 pages and just sit down with the last page with yourself or anybody that you're frustrated with and just start highlighting every single weakness that bothers you about them. And then just look across to the other column and see the strength that goes with whatever the corresponding weakness is. So that's the best way to do it. I recommend, especially with teams at work, that you do it together and people talk about, this is my #1 weakness strength combination. Here's activities that I like to do. Here's activities that I don't like to do. Here's when I'm energized. Here's when I'm depleted. And I know Andy and Kate facilitate some of that stuff with the disc. And I actually created a chart that organizes the strength weakness combinations based on the disc, so that you can sort of, and that goes back to awareness, right? That's part of the answer to this question, is that what Andy and his team do with DISC facilitates that awareness. You shouldn't be able to go through a DISC assessment without walking away going, hey, I know what some of my weaknesses and strengths are. So we need to put some time in on that awareness, but usually we know. It's just learning how the strength and weakness is connected, and that's what I try to facilitate with my table, with my chart.
So if we get that PDF, we'll get that back out to all the members who are on the call today. And I can tell you from experience, I did that for the first time. I think you were at Turner, maybe the first time I saw you in person.
Yeah.
I don't remember where, maybe that's where it was, but I did that, and the first page, did the second page, and you get to the third page, you start comparing them. I think there were 5 that you asked us to pick, and 4 of the 5 had a direct alignment to one another, which was, you know, kind of the magic in walking through the process from beginning to end.
Yeah.
Here's a really good question, and I'm sure some other people on this call are thinking the exact same thing. How do you convince others to see and embrace your strengths versus your weakness? And it says, i.e., your boss, but we could put, you know, spouse or anybody else in that little i.e. box.
Sure. You don't. You start by doing it for them, and usually you'll start to see some reciprocity, but not always. Again, this isn't about changing other people. And so you really don't. And that's also part of alignment. Alignment isn't just finding the right job. It's also finding the right boss, finding the right company, finding the right city to live in. I mean, I've been in some amazing cities, Amsterdam, Berlin, Barcelona, Paris, London. But guess what? I don't want to live in any of those cities. I live in a small rural town, 40,000 people, an hour outside of Raleigh. That's the right fit for me. This is not the right fit for me. This is a nice fit for vacation. This would be a terrible fit on a daily basis. I don't like the traffic. I don't like the crowds. I don't like the congestion. I don't like really anything about it, right? So it's not about changing other people. It's looking for those situations that fit. And when you have the wrong fit, I mean, I know you've shared this research before. You know, people don't leave companies, they leave managers, right? And so if you're in a situation where the person that you work for doesn't see your strengths, then you need to look for a situation where you can work for people who do see your strengths. You need to look for a company that has a culture of looking for strengths instead of trying to fix weaknesses. I mean, there's some companies that actually have sort of a requirement on performance evaluation to find people's weaknesses, to focus on people's weaknesses, to spend 90% of the evaluation looking at weakness fixing instead of in strength building. And so if that's the situation, it's not, I don't think it's worth your time to try to reverse that. You start asking yourself, what are some companies where this doesn't happen? What are some organizations where this doesn't happen? What are some companies that have a different philosophy? Should I even be working for anybody at all? Do I really believe that these are strengths enough that I would invest in myself? I mean, sooner or later, I went out on my own, right? I didn't wait for anybody else. I went out on my own. I put my money where my mouth was. And I said, I think these are my strengths. And I think if I could go 100% of the time on my strengths, I'd be more successful. And that's turned out to be true, but I had to bet on myself, right? So sometimes we're not going to get other people to bet on us. Now, you know, some things you can do. I mean, you could share the book with them. You could, if you think they'd be open to it. I don't think you're going to like completely turn someone around, but you could say, hey, I just, you know, listened to this interesting thing with Dave, and maybe you'd be interested. Check it out. You know, the TED Talk is pretty funny. The keynote on my website, super funny and entertaining. So maybe that helps them take the message a little bit better. Because some people say that, oh, good. Well, how do I get my wife to see my strengths? Well, and see that my weaknesses are also strengths. Well, you start seeing that her weaknesses are also strengths. You stop criticizing her for the weaknesses that she has. You start appreciating the things that you've been negative about in the past about her. Do the assessment together. So that's another thing that you can do, is sit down with the assessment. If you've got someone who's open-minded, and get them to look at that and talk about what some of your strengths and weaknesses are, talk about some of their strengths and weaknesses are. But again, that's probably not going to go well unless they understand the concept and they're open to the idea that weaknesses and strengths are connected, and that maybe acceptance is better than adjustment. But I think it is about, again, about situations, about alignment, and about finding the right fit. It's not necessarily about changing other people. I think that happens very, very rarely.
Totally agree. We do a lot of work in 5 dysfunctions. Pat, you mentioned Pat earlier, Lencioni, and a lot of it is you have to sit down in a room and do the exercise together to frame your mind around it. So I like the idea of doing the exercise together, at least as a start.
Yeah.
All right, Dave, that wraps up all the questions. Oh, wait, let's see. I have one more.
Okay.
What if I have an employee who won't admit there are weaknesses or corresponding strengths and is trying to fit in a role that isn't right for the person?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's right. Sometimes, it's our job to tell people the truth, even if they don't like to hear it. And that question is right on. Sometimes people haven't been taught this, they don't believe this, and even though this would actually be good news for them, we live in a world that teaches us that you can be anything you want to be. You can, if you just try hard enough and you want it bad enough, or they need the money, or they feel like they need the job, and so they're telling you they can change, they can be what you need them to be, whatever it happens to be. And sometimes you have to, you have to tell them the truth, and you have to enforce it if they're not willing to believe it. And so I do think, and this goes to alignment, sometimes we have to find the right fit, and sometimes we have to help people find the right fit. And sometimes it's showing them that what they're currently doing isn't the right fit. And if there is no other fit at our organization, it's asking them to leave. I don't think we need to wait until we've given up on someone as a human being before we fire them. I think we can simply say, hey, this just isn't the right fit for you. Hopefully we have some suggestions for what is the right fit. Hopefully we've tried to do some things like adjust their responsibilities, look in other areas of the organization, look for some teamwork opportunities. But if those don't exist, or if that's not feasible, I'm not saying with this message that everyone's awesome and everyone should always stay on the team forever. Alignment says exactly the opposite. Sometimes people aren't the right fit. They're not the right team member. They're not right for the culture. They're not right for the role. It's not because they're not a good person. It's a bad match. And sometimes we have to tell people that. And even if they tell us they're going to change, we have to be smart enough to know that they can't, even if they want to. And that even if they did, it wouldn't be as good as having the right person for that job. So I think we have to hire slow to look for that fit, and we need to fire fast once we see that it's not a fit and the person just isn't right for it. We need to pull the trigger on those kinds of things, and that doesn't mean we failed. It's an issue of alignment.
Awesome, great insight, Dave. Well, thanks for taking the time today to be with us and to share your information, wisdom, knowledge. I think it is very thought-provoking. A lot of folks out there that are listening still are thinking about this, and they'll have some great takeaways. Enjoy the rest of your travel, and travel safe back to the U.S., buddy.
All right, thanks a lot. Have a good one.
Thanks, Dave. Bye-bye.